good afternoon or morning, evening, night. Whenever you're watching this is Brooke. I'm going to be breaking down the pages of Good Readers and Writers by Vladimir Nabokov. I'm going to give some background of my experience with Nabokov and how he's influenced my writing. And at least in this, I might do, because it's not my work, I'm not going to do a separate video where I just read it as I do with my own work because of copyright and whatnot. So you can find this online. Um, so I'm going to read it as I read it as a writer, as an author. How do I want to be a good reader and a good writer? And what should I expect out of my readers? How do I get my readers to the next level of being good and great readers? From a teacher's perspective, how can this, reading this in class or talking through sections of it, help my students become better readers and writers, and so on and so forth? And my first exposure to this, I think, was in Andy Allegretti's class, and I believe it was critical reading and writing novels. And that's one of the first places where I came across Nabokov, where we read King, Queen, Knave. And this was used in several different classes. I did take a first novels class where we read Mary. And I'm totally blanking on the teacher's name off the top of my head. And back here, these are all some of the other Nabokov books. I've read The Defense. I have read large sections of Speak Memory. I've read... I'm missing some of the books here and I'm blanking on their names. They're kind of spread around, and I just found some. Oh, Despair. Found them at my parents' house. I've read the first 5 at least, and I've wanted to read them in order. Getting into The Gift, whereas he wrote his first 7 or 8 novels, I believe it is, in Russian, which was his native language. And then he moved to America. I'm not sure if he's actually in Russian. A lot of his stuff takes place in Germany. He might have moved to Germany. I didn't look up his background just for this video. And then he writes the rest in English, and he translated his works, and best I understand it, with his son into English. He is also known for writing poetry as well. So there is more of a poetic, wistful, artful side to his writing. But we read this in class, and for the longest time, there's a section we'll get to that I'll specifically talk through in my experience with it, because I've never forgotten it. I remember that Nabokov wrote an essay, this essay about being good readers and writers, but I couldn't remember the name of the essay. And as much as I'd even subscribed to the Paris Review and other places, just looking for interviews that he had to figure out what were his statements on these topics. And I was at my parents' house 2 weekends ago, and there's some new babies born with family friends. My wife went down to my parents' basement and came back upstairs. She was looking for a box of baby clothes for 6 months old. And she was like, honey, there's a box down there that says thesis notebooks. And I was like, that should never have been here, because we moved several times when I was in grad school. And so I tried to keep all my direct thesis stuff in the same location. Went down, there was actually 4 boxes. And I decided I would just go through them all that day and the next day. And one of those pieces that I found, and it turns out this was all the stuff that was on my desk. It's half the stuff made it to my new apartment, and I was able to use it to finish school. The other half was in these boxes that never should have been at my parents' house. Very confused, along with a lot of my teaching supplies that I wish I would have had when I was teaching at various colleges and other locations. And then to find this after what may have been 8 years, 6 to 8 years, I don't know. And to just have this to read through, I have underlined stuff, I have bracketed stuff. I'm pretty sure I've read this in classes before, when teaching is the sense, or when talking over the topic. And it's just had a profound impact on me and my understanding of how to write characters and get beyond, to write very unlikable characters, but characters that are a bit of a dumpster fire as a character, so to speak. Just the most horrible of people, or characters that are hard to understand, and you really have to go beyond the surface level of who that character is and how you identify with them to fully engage with them and the story that one sets out to tell. I'm not one. I started off wanting to write very fun stories. I came up with just ridiculous superheroes and villains, and as I started to approach writing superheroes and vigilantes here in Chicago, and how to write, how would like someone like Batman or Spider-Man address gang violence, the more and more I tried to ground my characters in reality, the more tragic and heartbreaking the story became. There's not a whole lot of necessarily tragic or heartbreak, I would say, that accompanies. There's a level of it that accompanies like Dr. Octopus and his shenanigans, or the Joker in even his murder sprees. But there's enough of a disengagement of reality for supervillains versus real crime that it doesn't reach. There's a level of tragedy with these characters. There's a level of tragedy with Batman because, as it's written by Grant Morrison or Arkham Asylum, he deserves, more or less, he's no crazier in his crusade to fight crime than the criminals that are in Arkham Asylum, is one of the points that he made in around like 89 or 91 when it came out. And the book was so popular, he was getting $1 off every copy that was sold, best I remember, and his editor called him the next day after it came out, or when they got the sales figures, and said, hey, I want you to know, like, you're a millionaire now, because over 1 million copies sold. It was huge. And so what are we to take from this? What does it mean for us to be good readers and writers? Nabokov is one of those writers that I go back to on a regular basis. I want to read his new books, but I go back and be like, man, how did you do that in chapter 1, chapter 2 of King, Queen, Knave? How do you set up illusion in the defense? Which, if you're not familiar with the defense, I love chess, and it's about I want to say, Russian grandmaster chess player who ends up going up against an Italian chess player. And as he begins to kind of realize midway through the book, so spoilers, that he's going to be losing this chess battle, he starts realizing that he's going to be losing in life as well, and that death will approach him. There's no way to avoid the end of life, just like there's no way to avoid being checkmate by Tarati. And there's scenes where, as he starts going kind of nuts, he sees tile floors and he starts positioning like, oh, that tree is a bishop and it's putting that couch, which is a pawn or like a knight, in danger. And he starts playing out the world as chessboards. It's being overlaid. There's a whole element of when they're playing chess, it's like music. Nabokov is a very synesthetic writer with how he gets the characters to think synesthetically. I've written, and part of the reason I want to hit Nabokov is because he's come up a lot in my journals and the essays I wrote when I was in grad school, and I plan on reading some of those, because another one of his short stories that I didn't even know who the author was. I just knew it was called Music, and a teacher brought it into class. Or actually, no, I didn't even read it in class. When I was in Prague, we just met we were in a pension, and we just met in like a room downstairs, community room. Someone left a copy of a story called Music on the table. And I picked it up and read it, and it blew my mind. And I have something that's called, I think it's in this folder, what I call rainbow drafts. I hope they're in here, or else I'll be greatly embarrassed. I have them in one of my folders. This folder is this is actually all of the most of the printed stuff from school that was given to me. Either way, I would go through short stories, novel sections, and I would print off copies of novels, and then just go through and highlight. This is every time a character's brought up. This is every time, this is where the dialogue is. This is every time We get a description of place. This is every time we get the varied description of character. This is where we get plot. And so I could just sit back and look at the colors and translate the pattern by which the information, the different information is given to us. So to not slow down the plot and to give us what are the relevant things at the most relevant time, even if we don't necessarily need to know this now, but we should know it now so we don't slow down the story later on. Those things that you want. This is the application of being a good reader to become a good writer. And I'll be doing I'm sure I'll do a video just on that topic, breaking down some of those stories and the way that I broke them down. And I took that and would apply that rainbow draft method to my own thesis, my own short stories, my own writing, to say, am I giving too much of a block text of certain things and slowing down the story too much? Is there just too much dialogue at sections and not enough reactions to go with the dialogue? Am I just doing an information dump in dialogue versus having characters actually talk? I was reading I've been editing someone's book, and they got to a section where a character kind of sat down and just kind of gave us a plot dump of her life and her background. What I noticed is, as much as she's telling it to us, she's not using the type of language we would use if we sat down at a table and we're telling a story. There's too many adjectives involving how things might have felt, or at least it felt very rehearsed. And this isn't a character who would have been able, in a position, to rehearse any of these stories beyond telling it to herself. But it just, without being part of a dialogue, it just kind of an info dump, which there's times for these things, wasn't working to the extent that the author really intended. And I'm here to read it and try to interpret the writer's intention and to give feedback as the reader and as an editor. So with that intro, we're going to get into this. I'm going to bring up some of his writing. I didn't want to do too much precursory reading or referencing to other books. I wanted some of this just, how has this impacted me over time and what comes back? And what am I going to pick up now? Because it's been 8 years and hundreds of thousands of pages, or hundreds of thousands of words since then, if not 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 pages since then. Oh, and I was going to say, for the music story, to go back, can you imagine trying to search who the author is of a short story named Music? Yeah, I had no idea who it was until I found it in a copy in a book, or it came up years later in another class. And I was like, that was Nabokov? The guy who wrote these other books that I obsess over? So yeah. Good readers and writers. My course, among other things, is a kind of detective investigation of the mystery of literary structures. How to be a good reader, or kindness to authors. Something of that sort might serve to provide a subtitle for these various discussions of various authors, for my plan is to deal lovingly, in loving and lingering detail, with several European masterpieces. 100 years ago, Flaubert, in a letter to his mistress, made the following remark. Please pardon my, I assume, French. Camelon serait savat si l'on connaissait bien sur sings et six livres. What a scholar one might be if one knew well only some half a dozen books. In reading, one should notice the fond details. There is nothing wrong about the moonshine of generalization when it comes after the sunny trifles of the book have been lovingly collected. If one begins with a ready-made generalization, one begins at the wrong end and travels away from the book before one has started to understand it. Nothing is more boring or more unfair to the author than starting to read, say, Madame Bovary, with the preconceived notion that it is a denunciation of the bourgeoisie. We should always remember that the work of art is invariably the creation of a new world, so that the first thing we should do is to study that new world as closely as possible, approaching it as something brand new, having no obvious connection with the worlds we already know. When this new world has been closely studied, then and only then let us examine its link with other worlds, other branches of knowledge. Yeah, I gotta read that again. And I'm gonna break it down while I do that. So in one reading, one should notice and fondle details. And I believe later in this, he says a good reader is a rereader. And this is what, as I just finished reading David Nance's The Triangle. And to kind of give the book cover, or the back of the book version of it, at least how it was told to me, and shut off your ears if you don't necessarily want to know. But the premise is there's some high schoolers that do some drugs and can't tell whether or not they're experiencing a kind of interdimensional alien invasion. And that's what I knew going into it. And that's what I was really looking for and wanted to get to, but it took 70 plus pages to get there. And I have to go back and reread the first 70 pages because honestly, as much as I was trying to read and notice and fondle details, and I was trying to do that, there was so much tension going into it that I was impatient in wanting to get to the twist, so to speak. The same thing would be, and it's much more of, I would put it under like a literary book versus, say, pop fiction, where there's some people that went through Columbia that I have their books, and it's, you get a murder mystery, a regular one. Let's say Watchmen. The first chapter, the comedian is killed. Spoilers. The mystery is we don't know who killed it, but we saw it from their first-person perspective of the comedian getting, like, shoved out a window. In crime thrillers, you typically in the first chapter have someone dies. There's a mystery of there is a body on the ground, and that is there as the hook for the audience to try to want to figure this out with the detective. And I'm not trying, there is a way I feel like I kind of am talking down to this sort of thing, but it doesn't, because it'd be like, I try to write literary fiction, and part of it is the difference of expediency, I think, that has come with, and that's not to say that there's bad writing in that. That's just kind of the difference of what editors are looking for. And the reason why David approached me is I'm not a regular editor. Is there a way to structurally change his book and whatnot, and in a way that the first chapter might seem more exciting? Whereas the difference of picking up a book that grabs you in the first paragraph because you are deeply into the plot versus something like Crime and Punishment, or as I kind of consider Native Son as a Chicago version of Crime and Punishment, where you start off with two guys. They're very much different mindsets between Bigger and Raskolnikov. Where Raskolnikov where he's very much getting the thoughts that he's going to do something that would be out of the ordinary for people, and he thinks this because he views himself grandurely as a type of Napoleon. Best I remember. It's been a while since I read the first chapter, or the first few chapters. Setting up the crime, which happens around 70 pages in. Very similar, I want to say, with Bigger, where he's just a guy, black guy in Chicago, who wakes up and he's just supposed to eventually, during the day, he's hired to drive some white folks out of Hyde Park to take them out to chauffeur them to dinner. And then the kind of crime, compared to Crime Punishment, happens after that. And it's nowhere near as intentional of a crime. If anything, there is an attempt to avoid becoming a criminal that he ends up accidentally performing another crime. But for Bigger, going into his day, a lot of the first section, and there's not chapters in that book, in Native Son, there's moments where he asks a friend, like, hey man, like, we want to get some more money, we can go to a movie, we'll go to the pool hall, but, do we want to knock off a store? If we do it to a black store in the black neighborhood, the Black Belt of Chicago, which is kind of the Bronzeville 30s through 40s area, separating downtown, which is north, to Hyde Park, which is in the south, starting at 51st Street. We knock off a black store, cops don't care, probably won't get found out. We won't make as much money. Or do we want to actually knock off a white store where we'll get more money, but possibly have the cops after us? And what are the things that he's kind of thinking about in the hours leading into the accidental crime later? And so when it came to just wanting to read, I definitely took time to notice and fondle details as I was reading David Dance's book, but I need to go back and do that again. And so let's go into the second line. There is nothing wrong about the moonshine of generalization when it comes after the sunny trifles of the book have been lovingly collected. If one begins with a ready-made generalization, one begins at the wrong end and travels away from the book before one has started to understand it. And that's honestly what happened to me when I was starting to read The Triangle. I was so encaptured with my first impression of the pitch that I had my ready-made generalizations about what was going to happen, and that was the wrong place to start versus focusing. And and that's not to say that I didn't focus on the page and what was happening, but just there was a level of tension there, very similar to, I think, if you watch the trailers for a movie, and you're kind of like, all right, get through the plot. The trailer is what I found most interesting. I want to get to these scenes and know what they're about, rather than taking the time to slow down and dig into the world that is there. Nothing is more boring or more unfair to the author than starting to read, say, Madame Bovary, with the preconceived notion that it is a denunciation of the bourgeoisie. We should always remember that the work of art is invariably the creation of a new world, so that the first thing we should do is to study that new world as closely as possible, approaching it as something brand new, having no obvious connection with the worlds we already know. When this new world has been closely studied, then and only then let us examine its links with other worlds, other branches of knowledge. I read this and I'm just like, Nabokov, like, this is what I've needed to hear again while writing. And what I should, how do you push your readers to that next level of being a good reader? Where this idea of going into Madame Bovary with the preconceived notion that it's a denunciation of the bourgeoisie, I'm going to have to get political here when it comes to how politics is played into the cancellation of novels and books. There was a book by Dave McKean, and I'm totally blanking on the other author, that was about a Middle Eastern boy who goes to a library, and I haven't read the book because the book got canceled. But the premise is a Middle Eastern boy who's going to be a suicide bomber goes to a library, say in London, reads some books, educates himself, and decides not to blow himself up. And from the Twitter response from people was that got the book canceled, that pressured the publisher, a very small minority pressured the publisher, saying British white guys, or whatever their ethnicity is, but I'm pretty sure Dave McKean is British white guy, can't or shouldn't write about these topics. They can understand these topics. And you could go into actually reading that book with this similar idea that Madame Bovary, with the preconceived notion that is denunciation of the bourgeoisie. We can go in with those assumptions, but we need to also be able to set those aside at the same time and let the work speak for itself. And in this case, that's a book I would have wanted to read. The Dave McKean book. I like his other graphic novels. I got some on my shelves. Where I want to know, like, just because he's white doesn't mean his idea of telling a story about someone from a different background isn't meaningful, that there's not some sort of value there. And maybe there's not value there, but I'm at least giving him a chance to write about risky material. How are we ever supposed to write about risky material? Again, if anything risky is going to get published. The same idea of, there was a Chinese woman who'd written a fantasy series that had slavery in it, and a bunch of People came out, you can probably guess what sort of background, came out and said, hey, she can't write about slavery. She doesn't know what it is. As if China didn't have slavery thousands of years before the Americas or the grand slave trade. And if we want to become good readers, we can take the premise of a book and say, you know what, I think it's going to cover this topic, but is it exclusively about that topic? Or are these actually characters and not just paper cutouts of people to talk about some sort of political agenda and whatnot? And it's fair to say that happens in books. And for the people that view books that way, I kind of wonder if those are the type of books that they read. And I wonder why I eventually stopped having any interest in reading books coming out by Marvel Comics. I love Marvel Comics. I have thousands of Marvel Comics, but most of them pretty much all predating 2015. Because there were bad readers who became bad writers. Not to say there weren't any good stories out there, but in general, we started getting more and more paper cutouts of characters. Not to say there weren't paper cutouts before there, but they were at least enough sculptured characters, people with feelings and with deeper motives and agendas out there. I feel like I'm gonna have to scrap this video and just start over again, but this is what I think about, and I have to think about this for my own writing because I write about human trafficking, abortion, domestic abuse. And it's like I'm just a white guy, but I make observations. I try to remain humble as much as I feel like my opinions are right. And I joke with my wife, it's hard to be the person that's the most correct in a room I go into. That's just the narcissistic writer coming out. I try to be well researched on all these topics. And, you know, how is someone, are the people that experience bad things, are they always put together the skill set and the tools to best write their stories? They can write a version of it, and it may be a very impassioned and accurate version of what happened. But there's also cases where they hand off that material to someone who's built more of a skill set for writing that, and perhaps they don't want to write the story themselves. Maybe they don't want to live in it. And that is part of the purpose of fiction, and part of the deep dive of fiction is to be able to get into other people's minds, whether try to encapsulate the mindset of a real person, or to create a fictional mindset that emulates a real person. I had written a bunch of African American characters, kind of gang characters, and some of them were kind of wooden, paper cut out as the first scenes, as I'm trying to figure out the first scenes of them. And by the time we finished reading the work, because I asked, they're like, I don't even know if you're the person that should write this. And I'm like, I guess. It's not like don't have a lot of like friends or done the research to be able to write these sort of characters in a way that would make them meaningful. And perhaps some of them by the end, not all of them, some of them might have been paper cutouts, but I'm trying to do the research. It's not just something that I'm making up based off solely trying not to be just my biases showing. I try to, regardless of where you come from in the world, you're a person. Even if you're a bad guy or a good guy, you're a person. You're going to do things that people do. Question is, are these necessarily believable things for these people? But it's like, no, people are going to eat. People are going to use the bathroom. People are most likely going to sleep unless they got some sort of superpower that doesn't let them do that. They're going to love people. They're going to hate people. Where as much as we get into the gray space of what's between good and bad, we're people. By the end of the script, I was like, hey, you know what? Let's just read the script and find out by the end if they feel as wooden or if they get rounded out. And by the end of the story, I was like, what did you think about the characters? And they're just like, you know what? The characters are working. To once again kind of prove that it doesn't matter necessarily what your ethnicity is in writing characters from different places and background. That is what fiction is. As much as we might write about what we know exactly. But dear God, how are you ever going to write science fiction or superhero fiction or about the gods or topics outside of your ethnic group if you're not if you don't have the capacity to even put yourself in those situations? And if you've never been a superhero, it's like, using the mindset that we run into from bad readers that are out there on Twitter, we could never write about anything. And if what they're saying, and part of what is said out there, and I know I'm not putting up the messages here. This is stuff that I've remembered over the last several years that people have reviewed this sort of material and put it kind of in the limelight because books are getting canceled, books that many people want to read. Comic creators are kicked out of the industry because they didn't vote the way that they're expected to vote, or they hold opinions they're not supposed to have. But what you do get from some bad readers and bad writers is you can, even if you're a white person, you can't understand the perspective of people from ethnic backgrounds. You can read it and you can't even fully understand it. Which one, they're saying that you're bad readers. And two, the other effect of that is if I can't understand a story written by these people that are saying these things, regardless of what their background is, if I can't understand it and they're telling me I can't, why should I ever buy their books? Why should I ever try to read their writing? Because I can't understand it according to them, which just tells me I can never be their audience member. Why should I send them money? And it is completely shrinking down the entire industry of publishing and storytelling. And so, is Madame Bovary about the denunciation of the bourgeoisie? You know what? I bet that's in there. I've only read sections of Madame Bovary. But it's about, are you going in there with the preconceived notion that that's all it's about? And it's like, it's about people. It's about characters. And maybe that happens in the book. But so much of it is, the book is there to tell you how it happens. Through characters, people, and places. In a specific time period. It's been so long since I've read any Madame Bovary to even go into that in particular. Nabokov, if you didn't know, I'm not sure what year he wrote this. Actually, I wonder if it says. I'm missing a page of it, so I have a document over here. It's not saying on the top of this document. You can look this up online if you want to see a hard copy of it. I'll probably post it in one of the social media channels, or you might be watching this video. I can put a link there. So, I'll just move down a little. Oh, I was saying Nabokov, like, he was publishing, I think, between, like, the 40s and, like, the 70s. I want to say Lolita came out in, like, the 60s, and Stanley Kubrick made a film on it. But that's a good example of, best I remember the book, my preconceived notion of it, is it's about a guy defending his desire to have relationships with kind of adolescent girls, or I think it's like he's kind of absorbed into a 14-year-old girl, which is another topic, and as well as dealing with younger people that is currently coming up nowadays. I'm just going to read the first, like, they have the chapter. They're like very short sections. And I think this might be like sub-chapters. That's one of the things I think Steinbeck liked to do. Either way, I haven't read Lolita possibly since that Allegretti class, but here we go. On page 9 of this copy of the annotated Lolita. I've been waiting to get to it until I actually got to it in the order of his books written. Lolita, light of my life, fire of my loins, my skin, my soul, Lolita. The tip of the tongue taking a trip of 3 steps down the palate to tap at 3 on the teeth. Lolita. She was low, plain low, in the morning, standing 4 feet 10 in one sock. She was Lola in slacks. She was Dolly at school. She was Dolores on the dotted line. But in my arms she was always Lolita. Did she have a precursor? She did. Indeed she did. In point of fact, there might have been no Lolita at all had I not loved, one summer, a certain initial girl child, in a princedom by the sea. Oh, when? About as many years before Lolita was born as my age was that summer. You can always count on a murderer for a fancy prose style. Oh, that's great, Nabokov. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, exhibit number 1 is what the seraphs and the misinformed, simple, noble-winged seraphs envied. Look at this triangle of thorns. And so there is a bit of a writing as a defense of his relationship with Lolita, just in this very opening, and that's his sense of audience. And one has to ask, why would someone want to read a book about this? I'm not going to take the time to dive into it, and I'll bring that up as I'm reading his Good Readers, Good Writers. There are several reasons to write a book like this and to read a book like this. And we'll get into that. And it's like I write about taboo topics. It's not something I set out to do. It's something that weighs heavily on me. And there's conversations that as a society, from my background as a Christian, as Christians, that we need to talk about, that we need to address. And it's like I initially thought that just writing about human trafficking was enough. And that's something my wife and I have a background in helping develop a nonprofit here in Chicago that offers, it's a drop-in space for trafficking survivors or women that are victims, and the idea of them becoming survivors. There's a mindset shift there. And I have all my reasons to do that, and you could probably just think there's a preconceived notion that it's a denunciation of the bourgeois, my version of that. And there's a level of surface level methodology and ideas and notions of why I want to do that. Is it simply the Christian thing to do? But there's a lot of Christians that didn't necessarily support the project. And so what drove my wife and myself to go there? Very similar as to the reasons of how you get into why you want to write things. Why would Nabokov want to write this book? Is this something that he dealt with in real life? Should we make that judgment about him? Or do we just have a study that New World is closely and approaching it as something, or that it's creation of a new world, so that the first thing we should do is study that new world as closely as possible, approaching it as something brand new, having no obvious connection with the worlds we already know. When this world has now been closely studied, then and only then let us examine its links with other worlds, other branches of knowledge. Some of this has to do with finishing the book and taking all that in, and then rereading and breaking and applying more of this. So, another question. Can we expect to glean information about places and times from a novel? Can anybody be so naive as to think he or she can learn anything about the past from these buxom bestsellers that are hawked around by book clubs under the heading of historical novels? But what about the masterpieces? Can we rely on Jane Austen's picture of landowning England with baronets and landscape grounds when all she knew was a clergyman's parlor and Bleak House, that fantastic romance within a fantastic London? Can we call it a study of London 100 years ago? Certainly not. And the same holds for other such novels in this series. The truth is that great novels are great fairy tales, and the novels in this series are supreme fairy tales. That's rough for me as a writer. Because it's like, what do I want to do? I want to write a Chicago that people want to go visit Chicago. In all of the black eyes and the gunshot wounds and the delicious meals and the plays and the opera. The issue is, you can't go visit that Chicago. The Chicago that I write about, chunks of it take place back in 2004. I can't even go back to the restaurant my wife and I went on for our first date, or the night that we met. That restaurant doesn't even exist anymore. I am torn on this. Like, this really challenges me because, at least when it comes to wanting to be able to write about a certain era, where do I go? Do I go to history books? No, typically I go back and read novels. However, the thing is, if I wanted to actually know about Vienna during the 1700s, there's a lot of letters from Mozart and Beethoven that I can actually read to, if I want a very accurate idea of those locations and times and get a semblance of that, I can get that out of their letters. And so letters would actually be a better place to go, or memoirs, but even still, all of it's still through the lenses of those writers. But there is a very special thing that he's hitting here of those books may use, those places aren't London. It is the window dressing of the era where characters and the place where characters live in a fictional world. Just like my Chicago doesn't exist. I make up roads that don't exist in my Chicago. I make up characters that don't exist in my Chicago. I make up restaurants. They might allude to other things, an amalgamation of things that happened, but they're still not real. But maybe the sense of Chicago is enough there that people want to go visit. Maybe, or in 100 years, they could be like, I want to, what does that place look like now? Does it resemble the fictional place that I read about? The truth is that great novels are great fairy tales, and the novels in this series are supreme fairy tales. I believe the series this is written like a introduction to a course. He might have been teaching at like Cornell. I didn't look that up. I apologize. If you're listening to this, you know how to Google. All right, let's continue. I'm already 40 minutes in on the second page. This is awesome. Time and space, the color of the seasons, the movements of muscles and minds, all these are for writers of genius, as far as we can guess, and I trust we guess right. Not traditional notions which may be borrowed from the circulating library of public truths, but a series of unique surprises which master artists have learned to express in their own unique way. I wish I could express myself this eloquently in so few words. Time and space, the color of seasons, the movements of muscles and minds. All these are for writers of genius, as far as we can guess, and I trust we guess right. Not traditional notions, which may be borrowed from the circulating library of public truths, but a series of unique surprises, which master artists have learned to express in their own unique way. How do we capture the observations of our lives and separate those things from, as he describes it, the circulating library of public truths? How do we, and this is one of the notions I've been getting to when I'm talking to people about what does literature look like from 2022 beyond? I can go back and look at the 1800s. I could explain for those who don't know, the modern short story, or what we know as short stories, what we know as novels, and how they're told, didn't start till like the 1600s and really the 1700s. There's short stories and long form stories and plays and epic poems prior to then, but we've only been telling stories this way. And there's orally told stories. You can look at the Bible or the Quran or other religious texts. There's histories of different regions of the world. When it comes to sitting down and breaking down fictional characters on a very large scale, or even the small scale of short stories, these things are new. They're new. And so, we have the development of authors over the last 300, 400 years. How do I play in, and I'm pretentious enough, maybe naive enough to believe that I could play into the next 400 years of storytelling. What do I have to add to the canon? Because we're not focusing on circulating library of public truths, but a series of unique surprises, which master artists, and eventually, hopefully, I plan to be a master artist, have learned to express in their own unique way. How do we tell these things in something that's unique to us? What makes us an author versus a drone? When I hear this, I think about circulating library of public truths. And there's a sense that I have of reading that, and I'm not trying to be postmodern and being like, the way that I what he's saying here and how I interpret it is this. But what comes to mind just trying to read this is circulating library of public truths is in modern terms in 2022 the mass media narrative of events of things that happen. We have the right thought versus the right think versus the wrong think, which we get into in dystopian fiction like 1984 and Fahrenheit 451 and the like, the Brave New World. And then honestly, like, and I think back, what's Lolita, if not breaking away from the circulating library of public truths? In so much as the perspective it's told from. I can't tell you how it ends. I don't remember. As much as we might have talked about it in class. This next part I have underlined. So let's see what I thought was important at the time. To minor authors is left the ornament of the commonplace. Which might be where I am. It's to a degree, it's the reader's response is how I find that out. Or maybe they're just not as smart as I am to understand my genius. And maybe like Melville, no one will recognize what I write until after I'm dead. Or with like Kafka. You're going to die broke, I think, like Edgar Allan Poe or other people. To minor authors is left the ornamentation of the commonplace. If we're not super artists, this is what we land with. These do not bother about any reinventing of the world. They merely try to squeeze the best they can out of a given order of things, out of traditional patterns of fiction. These do not bother about any reinventing of the world. They merely try to squeeze the best they can out of a given order of things, out of traditional patterns of fiction. I feel like there's a comma before the traditional patterns of fiction. And like I said, I can be completely reading this wrong. As you're hearing this, you might get something else, but I guess I can only come from where I'm at right now as an aspiring writer and someone who has some teaching experience and wants to hopefully improve the toolkit of teachers who teach writing and forms of storytelling or learning new languages, because applications of that within fiction and whatnot are a great place to learn how to write in a new language and to visualize things in a new language. They don't reinvent the world. They, versus before where it talks about the difference of remembering that the work of art is invariably the creation of a new world. So these people may not even think about it as they're not trying to create a new world as closely as possible, approaching it as something brand new, having no obvious connection with the worlds we already know. They accept it as the world that we already know. Or at least close enough if it's science fiction or something like that. Perhaps. I'm trying to decide to what degree all of this is universal in the metaphors or the comparisons I'm trying to make. They merely try to squeeze the best they can out of a given order of things, out of traditional patterns of fiction. This is how we tell stories, and we tell stories about these normal things. The various combinations these minor authors are able to produce within these set limits may be quite amusing in a mild, ephemeral way, because minor readers like to recognize their own ideas in a pleasing disguise. Oh boy, he is so on the mark. And this is, I have moments where I'm just a bad reader. I'm not always reading at the level I should. Or I'm so focused on trying to be a good reader that I miss so much of the scope and depth that I'm not used to looking for. But this so hits on The issues of readers, the various combinations these minor authors are able to produce within these set limits may be quite amusing in a mild, ephemeral way because minor readers like to recognize their own ideas in a pleasing disguise. And I definitely see this as a writer where it's like I see other writers doing things. I'm just kind of like, yeah, that's awesome. And it's like because I want to tell that story, but I can't do it as well. It's my own idea in a pleasing disguise. But the real writer, the fellow who sends planets spinning and models a man asleep and eagerly tampers with the sleeper's rib, that kind of author has no given values at his disposal. He must create them himself. The art of writing is a very futile business if it does not imply first of all the art of seeing the world as the potentiality of fiction. The material of this world may be real enough, as far as reality goes, but does not exist at all as an accepted entirety. It is chaos, and to this chaos the author says go, allowing the world to flicker and to fuse. It is now recombined in its very atoms, not merely in its visible and superficial parts. The writer is the first man to mop it and to form the natural objects it contains. These berries there are edible. That speckled creature that bolted across my path might be tamed. That lake between those trees will be called Lake Opal, or more artistically, Dishwater Lake. That mist is a mountain, and that mountain may be conquered. Up a trackless slope climbs the master artist, and at the top, on a windy ridge, whom do you think he meets? The panting and happy reader. And there they spontaneously embrace and are linked forever if the book lasts forever. Actually, getting a little teary-eyed reading that. And to be honest, and like I said, this is my narcissism. Because this is the realm that at least I write in. Whether I'm good at that writing or telling a good story, I've learned what it means to write in chaos. There's definitely moments and scenes. I'll have an idea of a scene to get into, or I might. A good example, spoilers if you have any interest in reading my work. After I lived in Prague for a summer and just came to love the place. And there's a lot of historical connections between the Czech people, particularly in Prague, with Chicago. Chicago's mayor, Mayor Chermak, or as we call the street, Cermak, of the 1920s, 1930s, maybe it started in the 19 teens, was born in Bohemia. People from Chicago sent bricks and stuff to put into, I believe, the state opera in Prague. The second highest financial district outside of the Mag Mile and around the year 1900 was the little village, which was initially founded by Czechs, which is now run in Latinos. And I write about this in my book, but I came back from Prague having just the fondest memories of those skylines of the castle there on the hill above near Latinsky Park over the Vltava River. And I went to church. We were meeting in a gym at Moody Bible College. And for the background for the music, it had just a silhouette of Chicago skyline with the Sears Tower and the Hancock Building. And I just had this image of this chaos, really, this chaos of what if the Chicago or what if Prague Castle somehow was added to that skyline? And it's been absolute chaos to a degree to figure out how I can make that happen in possibly some of the most absurd ways and what would be the effects of that. And the effects of that adding to Chicago skyline is absolute chaos. How do you write that? But to get to this on a more simple level, let's reread this, man. The various combinations these minor authors are able to produce within these set limits may be quite amusing in a mild, ephemeral way, because minor readers like to recognize their own ideas in a pleasing disguise. And it's amazing because I actually have this whole section is marked, that next section I read. And while I'm reading this, consider it boggles my mind if people sit down and plot out an entire book. There is, how do you, if you've plotted out a story to a degree, and honestly, when I was working on a film, I needed to have a sense of by page, roughly a page's, there's a minute a page with how you format a film script. I know if I'm going to write a 110-minute film, I need to like hit certain beats at certain points. But I didn't necessarily have all the plot figured out beforehand. And there's a level of, if you plot everything out, at least for myself, it becomes very boring and tedious. Where is the room for chaos? And perhaps I have really great story ideas, but bending the character to those story ideas can very easily make the detriment of that actual story moment you want to get to. But granted, how do you write a mystery novel? It's one thing to write a mystery novel where you know the mystery, and there's another one to have to figure it out as you go. And I'm much more the person that wants to figure it out as I go. The real writer, the fellow who sends planets spinning and models a man asleep and eagerly tampers with the sleeper's rib. That kind of author has no given values at his disposal. He must create them himself. The art of writing is a very futile business if it does not imply, first of all, the art of seeing the world as the potentiality of fiction. I think that makes me think of Stephen King. I love his I've read the novella The Mist, and then I think about the film by Frank Darabont. Check it out. As best I understand it, I saw in an interview, he said the idea, it's about a bunch of people that get trapped inside of a supermarket and surrounded by monsters. The idea for that, and this is the potentiality of fiction, he was in like a Walgreens or a drugstore and pictured a pterodactyl flying around. There was a potentiality of fiction in how he viewed the world. The material of this world may be real enough as far as reality goes, and that's where I try to plant stuff in a version of Chicago, but does not exist at all as an accepted entirety. It is chaos, and to this chaos the author says go, allowing the world to flicker and to fuse. It is now recombined in its very atoms, not merely in its visible and superficial parts. The writer is the first man to mop it and to form the natural object. That idea of like, you're the first person there to like mop it, to like clean up a mess, or to organize. And to form the natural objects it contains. Those berries there are edible. That speckled creature that bolted across my path might be tamed. That lake between those trees will be called Lake Opal, or more artistically, Dishwater Lake. That mist is a mountain, and that mountain must be conquered. Up a trackless slope climbs the master artist, and at the top, on a windy ridge, whom do you think he meets? The panting and happy reader. And there they spontaneously embrace and are linked forever, if the book lasts forever. I can definitely say that linked forever, like, I feel that having finished David Dance's book. Like, I feel this connection to understanding, I can't simply say I understand him, but understand his writing, and I understand his characters, and I wanted to live in that place, and I didn't want the book to end. I felt that tension getting close, and I felt the same way when I finished East of Eden, and you finished some other like longer books. I think the entire One Piece community who read the manga are wanting this. They're waiting for the end, just like Berserk readers are waiting for the end of Berserk, or Hunter x Hunter readers are waiting for the end of Hunter x Hunter. Both Berserk and Hunter x Hunter, the author of Berserk died, and the author of Hunter x Hunter has been so sick, or at least some of it was sick, in bad health, that we may never finish the end of his amazing journey of Gon, Killua, Karapika, and the doctor guy. whose name eludes me. To just say go. Over here, I will uncover this. I had an idea. First day, 11/1/2020. I was doing NaNoWriMo, which is a National Novel Writing Month. You write 50,000 words in 1 month. The premise that I had for writing a novel in that time span was I have a character in my book, kind of a higher ranking gang lieutenant who, and then I have a lower one. And this is spoilers for this work. But and maybe by the time you read, if you were to read any of these or they get published, you might not remember, but I have a character, the lower rank of guys, I think it might be Rico, finds out that the upper guy has gotten one of their trafficked women pregnant. And Rico is the messenger to tell the higher lieutenant, that he got a girl pregnant. And I didn't necessarily know how that scene was going to go. I just kind of had that premise. I didn't have a whole lot of setup. That was just kind of, hey, what's something that happens? What's a somewhat realistic situation that you might come across involving gangland? And the characters that I've already developed. I wanted to develop the lieutenant more, and I want to develop Rico more, and this was a situation by which I don't know what Rico's going to do. Like he doesn't like this, and I just said go. Just go and tell him this information. And how do they're not fully fleshed out characters, but as I get these responses, and part of it's wanting to go find a dramatic response from people, but just try to let them do their thing, even though they're not like developed, so to speak, characters. Versus if it was like Wolverine from the X-Men, or how would Cyclops or Magneto react to these things. And the lieutenant says, oh my gosh, like, how far along is it? And then Rico's about to answer, and the guy's just like, I don't care. Get rid of it. And Rico's in this situation of, I've never really thought about having a woman get an abortion. I don't really know how I feel about this. At least being the middleman. Like, should I care? Should I not care? Like, why doesn't this guy take the responsibility to take care of it himself? Why, like, obviously doesn't care about the pregnant woman, or at least the fetus, the baby, as I see it from my religious point of view. Unborn baby. But then I decided, you know what? Day 1, 11/1/2020. I said, I want to write a story about someone of that lieutenant, spoilers. I don't know necessarily what order these books would be released. Trying to figure out how to do this in the most dramatic way. But either way, how do you go from someone who was nearly aborted, whose mother considered abortion but ended up not having it for reasons of which I did not know at the time. All I know is that she ends up having the kid, to that kid later becoming someone who is pro-abortion, or tells someone else to have his child aborted. So 11/1/2020, I sat down and out of nowhere, I have a basic understanding of my fictional Chicago. I've never explored it in the 1980s. I had to make that up. I did some kind of research while I was writing to make sure at least I had like pop music references. And actually some of that played in really well with the motivations of the characters. And we get out of nowhere, just out of the ether, when Teddy smiled at Maria with the white Tootsie Pop stick jetting out of the edge of his mouth, his cheek ballooning out, and eyes shut with his smile, Maria was entranced. Sitting beside him, she leaned forward and ran her hand over the crown of his head down to the nape of his neck, feeling the fuzzy prick of the stubble growing in. He was going to be getting it shaved later this week. She was so confused by him. She was usually into guys with a bit more hair and usually a little more college ambition. The humidity and temp were perfect for a Saturday afternoon in La Valita Park. The boombox laced the air with trills of smooth harmonic accordion melodies. This wasn't the summer Maria had expected when she'd come home from Southern Illinois University. Her parents had wanted her to stay at school and work there for the summer. The city was always a hotbed of violence in the summer with thousands of shootings and hundreds of deaths. She never expected to meet Teddy while she was working at the Tasty Treat. Now they were sitting on a blanket in the park as if they were in a college version of a John Hughes movie. Her favorite was Ferris Bueller's Day Off, and that's what this summer was like. No school, all play. You can judge whether or not that was good writing. This is the first time I've read it since I wrote it, to be honest. I have this here because I'm planning to record myself reading this and see what I can get back for an additional draft. But that's just off the top of my head. I put together this fictional world, and I just said, "Go, let's see what we have for this character." I didn't sit there and pre-plan. I want them at a park. I want them at wherever. I don't know where they're going to work. I just sat down and pictured an image of a couple, in particular, like a Latino couple in the 1980s, somewhere in Chicago. Not know what they're going to say, what they want, what they're doing. But I had no idea where I'm going to end up at the end of the book. No idea where it's going to be midway through the book. No idea when the abortion topic's going to come up. No idea. No idea whatsoever. All of it, just pure chaos. And let's go. And I can say, if you get to the point, at least for myself, I would write for the day, go to sleep, and I was writing, maybe just starting at 500. I was starting at 500 words per day because I hadn't written in a while. And so it's very easy to finish writing for the day, and then by the time you sit down to write the next day to write another 500 words, you can kind of plan out those events throughout the day. When I'm doing dishes, when I'm taking a shower, I'm driving around, I'm just thinking about what happens next. What do I find interesting? Where do we go from here? But the ultimate magic place to go to is once I get to about 1,500 words, that's the place of which I can only plan about 1,500 words of writing for a day. So between doing the dishes, taking a shower, all those things, in the back of my mind or in the front of my mind, I can only picture 1,500 words per day. And there is a sense of I am just saying go, and I'm picturing that before I write it. Once I hit that threshold of 1,500 and I might take a break and have to come back, it is game on creative chaos. Because I have no idea where it's going from there. And it's just, what happens next? What do the characters do now? What do they do? What happens next? Does someone die? Do they meet significant people in their lives? Where's the drama? There's something of dramatic, fortune has to happen to them. And they got to the point I was just telling Rochelle, I was like, man, I think the most words I've ever written a day was 4,500. And I was like, you know what? I bet there's no reason I can't do 5,000 words in a day. And so I sat down the next day, or within a few days, and I went for that record. And I hit 5,000 words, and I can't even, I can probably recall most of the events of this book. Probably all the major scenes. I could probably sit down and just, I saw it that clearly when I wrote it. I made sense of that chaos, and it had an impact on me. A lot of impact as I challenged myself with this topic of families in Chicago, raising kids and in various levels of gangland and gang activity, and try to ground it in a world similar to the world that's out there, but it's also in the 80s and the 90s and 2000s. And that's before I ever moved here. Nor do I grow up with a Latino heritage or background. Not that plays into it necessarily a ton. And then the next day I think I did 1,500 words, and I was just like, no reason I can't do 6,000. And then with a day of kind of a break, 1,500 words in between. I did 6,000 words, and like once you pass that 1,500 word, whatever, if you're sitting down to write and you ever reach that point in creating fiction and you've gone past where you've planned and don't know where you're going to land this helicopter, you're just flying over the ocean or you're flying over like a sea of trees or fields and you don't have any idea where you are off the map. It is peak chaos, peak creativity. It is, to an extent, he kind of talks about here, peak art. Whether or not it's enjoyable art, there is the question of what is the quality of art. You are hitting a creative zone that is unexplored for you. And ideally, because you're wandering into the chaos, your reader is also on that journey. They're in the back of the helicopter as you're just like frantically trying to figure out where can I even land because I'm running out of fuel. Like, oh my gosh, we're going down. They're along for the ride and they're just as scared to a degree as the ground starts getting really close and really bigger. And maybe and it's like you're only getting static on the radio. You're just not sure what's going to happen. And is there a lake or someplace I can try to put down a little bit softer and hopefully not drown in the process? Or maybe if I crash into some trees, they'll slow me down enough. Or is there some hay, like a ton of hay on the field? Or is there snow somewhere? Like, how do we land this thing? Oh my gosh. And it's exciting and to a degree, and compared to that creativity, it's like, oh, this is going to be kind of dark, but there's a degree of when I'm not in that zone or creating something, being out in the unknown. Like even right now, this is chaos. Me talking about this, reading this, I am just going in and out of chaos as I'm trying to talk through this. Obviously, with that metaphor I used. Everything else seems kind of bland and depressing because that chaos is where I want to be. And if I'm out of that chaos, that creative space long enough, I am not the most pleasant person to live with. And my wife could attest to this so hard. And probably the people that know me. Not that my wife would be the only person that would necessarily know to what degree I'm writing. There might be others I'll be talking about it. And if I'm writing, it's very possible I'm talking about it and trying to process ideas with people that I run into. But boy, am I a different person. It is amazing. I really want to read more of Teddy and Maria in the park. I guess I'll read the rest of the section to give you a sense of like just that first day. And I'm sorry, we'll get back to Nabokov. This is going to have to be more than like one sit down to read this because I'm only on page like 4. If you could go anywhere in the world, Teddy said, then took the Tootsie Pop out of his mouth, where would you want to move? Where would you want to move it? Where would you want to move? Should be what it says. She rocked back and forth with her arms crossed. My abuela lives down in Florida. She lives in Orlando, and we went there every year for Christmas when I was growing up. She paused and turned her gaze to the trees above them and peered at the sun through the leaves. We go to Disneyland and all the other parks. We take a day to drive to the ocean and sometimes go to the Gulf. There are always green leaves on the trees in Christmas. I've always wanted to have a palm tree as a Christmas tree. While she spoke, Teddy struggled to pay attention. I think Orlando is the best place in the world for me. And let's not forget I've always wanted to be an animator at Disney. Her gaze came down to meet his eyes slightly wandering around the park. She dismissed the observation as disinterest. Which reminds me, when are we going to go see The Great Mouse Detective? It came out 3 weeks ago and I don't want to miss it while it's in theaters. Do you have any plans for Saturday? I have it off. Teddy's eyes snapped to Maria. Yeah, I think the guys have something set up that night. We can hit up a matinee and head over to the barbecue if you'd be down. Oh, that sounds great. I didn't really like The Black Cauldron, but The Fox and the Hound is my favorite animated movie. I talked with Susie, my roommate down at SIU, and she said the animation in Detective was really solid, and it had a great story, too. First 500 or so words. Can't say they're the most eloquent. They are whether or not, as a reader, to what degree you're engaged. Maybe the hook of how is this strange dude in a Star Wars shirt gonna like tell this story? Can it even be interesting? That's a very fair question. What happens next? But what I can tell you is this was absolute chaos. I can see, and you could probably pick up this too. I asked the question. I was like, "Why does she care about the Great Mouse Detective?" I was like, "Oh yeah, I said that she wants to be an animator." Like, obviously, that is the mindset of where I sorted out of the chaos what the character wants. But I was even just kind of like, "Why am I writing about like? Why does she care so much about like cartoons?" And it's like I already told myself. But I found myself even just asking that as the reader, and I'd forgot what she said she wanted to do. I'm not always the best reader, like I said. Oh man, I want to read. I want to read more of this book, but we're now 75 minutes in, and page 4 of Good Readers and Good Writers, and I guess like it is about that. But as I said, it's what do I take out of this as a writer? What do you take out of this as a writer? And hopefully, there's enough of a conversational tone to have you as the audience to follow along with this. And I'm not completely boring you. One evening at a remote provincial college, through which I happened to be jogging on a protracted lecture tour, I suggested a little quiz 10 definition of a reader. And from these 10, the students had to choose 4 definitions that would combine to make a good reader. I have mislaid the list, but as far as I remember, the definition went something like this. Select 4 answers to the question that should a reader be to be a good reader. Here we go. A nice, wonderful quiz activity for students. Wish I would have had this for my students. I knew where this stupid paper was when I was teaching. But I suppose if you're listening to this, there is a degree of you being my audience or my students. The reader should belong to a book club. The reader should identify himself or herself with the hero or heroine. The reader should concentrate on the social economic angle. I can tell you who does that as readers. I wouldn't necessarily care if people weren't trying to cancel books. Okay? People can read the way they want, but let the fiction and the writing speak for itself. Where would we be as a society? I'm just going to ask this question. Where would we be trying to figure out, and it's going to go dark, the Holocaust, if we didn't have Mein Kampf? Where would we be? How would we figure things out? What was the basis of it? But Hitler spelled it out pretty well. And I'd probably say universally we can look at his writing and say, 1, I kind of wish he wouldn't have written this, but 2, I'm glad he did so I can identify these bad ideas if I see them in the future. I live in chaos. I'm sorry. The reader should prefer a story with action and dialogue to one with none. That's interesting because Marvel did a challenge back in 2001, maybe? It was during the Grant Morrison run of X-Men, but Marvel said, we're good enough storytellers, we can have an entire month where all of our comics are lacking dialogue. And I had no idea that was what they planned, and all of a sudden I got to a month of comics and none of them had words. And the question is, to what degree were these silent comics telling good enough stories through the artwork and the paneling and the action that they were still intriguing stories? The reader should have seen the book in a movie. Can be helpful to a degree. It was very hard for my wife to actually sit down and read V for Vendetta by Alan Moore. We actually watched the movie, which is a bad adaptation, but at least it helped her get past some of the ideas and kind of the rough artwork you have to get used to a bit from 1980s artwork. Who is the artist? I have it right here. David Lloyd. David Lloyd. It's right here. It's my Alan Moore section. Like this whole section swath here. The reader should be a budding author. The reader should have imagination. The reader should have memory. The reader should have a dictionary. The reader should have some artistic sense. The students leaned heavily on emotional identification, action, and the social, economic, or historical angle. Of course, you have guessed, the good reader is one who has imagination, memory, a dictionary, and some artistic sense, which sense I propose to develop in myself and in others whenever I have the chance. Ooh. Now, here's the question. We're going to go look at book reviews on Amazon's or elsewhere. Are the people leaning at heavily at emotional identification, action, and socioeconomic or historical angle? Or are they good readers who have imagination, memory, a dictionary, and some artistic sense, which sense I propose to develop in myself and in others whenever I have the chance? And this is, we're still not quite to the part that I appreciate the most, that I always go back to. But like that quiz, that idea of what is a good reader, has imagination. I want to say I have that. I want to say I have memory, at least of the fiction. I don't necessarily have a dictionary, and I think that's definitely one of my. I lean more towards probably a style closer to Steinbeck than Nabokov myself. Nabokov is someone you got to read with a dictionary. Steinbeck, at least East of Eden, my favorite novel, not so much that I remember. Couldn't even find my copy of it. I'm like, did I let someone borrow it? And some artistic sense, and I want to say I have hopefully some artistic sense. I do. Is it good artistic sense? Oh. In that artistic sense, these things, we're going to see how he wraps these things together. This is, to have this here in this story is amazing. Incidentally, I use the word reader very loosely. Curiously enough, one cannot read a book. One can only reread it. A good reader, a major reader, an active and creative reader is a rereader. And I shall tell you why. When we read a book for the first time, the very process of laboriously moving our eyes from left to right, line after line, page after page, this complicated physical work upon the book, the very process of learning in terms of space and time what the book is about, this stands between us and artistic appreciation. I want to say, best I remember, he's going to compare. Yep, he does. This is how well I remember this. He compares it to looking at a painting. I'll let him explain that. This is actually something I ran into when I was reading David Nance's book, where there are definitely moments where he would have like a paragraph of dialogue, and then at the end it would say, like, Lucy said, or Jack said, or Lucky said. And it was hard to necessarily know how to read that dialogue without knowing who said it. And sometimes it would work that I knew there's enough people in the conversation that I would get the context of the person saying it. Sometimes I wasn't sure. But if this is where if you actually have like, oh, please, comma, Jack said, and then you continue the larger paragraph. With the oh, please, at the same time I'm reading oh, please out loud, my eyes have already seen that Jack has said it. So I know that it's already Jack saying, "Oh, please," even though I didn't technically read that out loud first, but my eyes saw it at the same time as I was verbally processing it. And so if there's a short enough section in the front, you don't have to say Jack responded, the text. Your eyes can pick up maybe 6 to 7 words and then see who said it. You know while you're physically looking at it. And he was much more prone to have the text with saying who said it at the end. It's one of my big kind of flags I was waving around. You keep doing this. Just break it up. Do a little something else. And I'm sure that I have things that I just do over and over again that aren't the best practices of writing. But let's see how he breaks this down. What does it look like to just go through the action? And this is the same thing of if you're listening to the auditory book, you don't have to focus on your eyes actually moving, but there is still that step that you have after you would read something that now you're hearing it out loud or you're hearing it in your head, of taking the time to picture all of the images, all the events, to process the emotions of the characters without knowing what happens later. And that artistic sense of going back and rereading something to be able to understand the importance of all those character interactions, why the author points out different things in the background, why he has people have certain discussions, why they have different feelings, to understand the artistic sense of where do the characters start, where does the world start, and how do the characters or the world change as the plot progresses. And that's why I want to go back and reread David's book to give him a more thorough analysis of especially the first 70 pages as I was getting used to actually understanding who the characters are. And I'm someone who, I'll finish watching a TV show and I'm like, I want to go back and rewatch it. I'm not necessarily that way with novels. I am that way when it comes back to rereading sections of novels, but I'll definitely do that with short stories. It's just novels, I'm developing the patience of being a good reader to reread novels. But at least on the second time around, there's enough that you can picture and understand of the characters to pick up the artistic senses that Nabokov is talking about here. When we look at a painting, we do not have to move our eyes in a special way, even if, as in a book, the picture contains elements of depth and development. The element of time does not really enter in a first contact with a painting. In reading a book, we must have time to acquaint ourselves with it. We have no physical organ, as we have the eye in regarding to a painting. I have that written on the side of this. No organ for story like a painting. Good reader rereads. But at a second or third or fourth reading, we do, in a sense, behave towards a book as we do towards a painting. However, let us not confuse the physical eye, that monstrous masterpiece of evolution, with the mind, an even more monstrous achievement. Which reminds me, his book 4, I don't have it on my shelves, is called The Eye. A book, no matter what it is, a work of fiction or a work of science, the boundary line between the two is not as clear as is generally believed. A book of fiction appeals first of all to the mind. The mind, the brain, the top of the tingling spine is, or should be, the only instrument used upon a book. Now, this being so, we should ponder the question, how does the mind work when the sullen reader is confronted by the sunny book? First, the sullen mood melts away, and for better or worse, the reader enters into the spirit of the game. He writes this so well! And he has those artistic moments of where he says, the mind, the brain, the top of the tingling spine is or should be the only instrument used upon a book. But, and I say he writes well, is just how well he captures his thoughts to convey them to us as readers. This being so, we should ponder the question, how does the mind work when the sullen reader is confronted by the sunny book? First, the sullen mood melts away, and for better or worse, the reader enters into the spirit of the game. I don't usually think of writing, or at least reading, as a game, but nowadays we got gamification of training, gamification of work, of measuring our output versus our input. But reading is a game. It is a game. Is there's rules. There is an objective by which you are trying to win the game. Just like in the book, as you're reading, there are rules and you're trying to solve the game. The effort to begin a book, especially if it is praised by people whom the reader recently deems to be too old-fashioned or too serious, this effort is often difficult to make, but once it is made, rewards are various and abundant. As I read this, I immediately thought about the criticism of the Oscars, of it's all these movies that no one has seen. Those are viewed as the artistic movies. The effort to begin a book, especially if it is praised by people whom the reader secretly deems to be too old-fashioned or too serious. That's kind of how I think about Oscar reward members. That's kind of how I feel about judges in general for fiction and art. Oh, these are the things that we should worry about. But it's have I really taken time to watch a bunch of Oscar-winning movies? Not really. When I hear them say these are artistic movies, it's I don't care. There is a question of to what degree am I watching films for art? I typically am more watching for storytelling, and maybe there's good storytelling in those. I want to say Gran Torino was up for some rewards. I did watch that, and that's because it was up for awards, but it happens to be one of the films that was, and I had a friend who was not too old-fashioned or too serious that recommended it to me. It was very surprised by the recommendation. This effort is often difficult to make, but once it is, rewards are various and abundant. Since the master artist used his imagination in creating his book, it is natural and fair that the consumer of a book should use his imagination too. I wish someone would have told me this in high school. We would just read. I had no interest whatsoever in the books or the short stories or the poems that was presented in high school, and I think part of that was because what was I interested in? Anime, Dragon Ball Z, Gasaraki, Record of Lodoss War, Evangelion, X-Men, Record of Lodoss War 2nd Series, Legends of Crystania, Macross, Macross Plus. I wasn't into Fables, wasn't out when I was in high school, but X-Men, Punisher, the Bible, all add in there. I finally got to it on the shelf, not necessarily last place. JLA, Justice League of America, Justice Society of America. Those forced me to use my imagination. I never had any interest in applying my imagination to Shakespeare. It was nothing there from I necessarily had any interest in even giving it a chance. My senior year, we shot scenes and in small groups of scenes from Hamlet, which gave me a much better appreciation to those scenes, and it allowed us to work through those scenes and actually picture them fully. And I was in plays in high school. I had some pretty fun roles that I had, and acting out a script was way more engaging from a imagination perspective than reading stuff in class. And then we kind of wrote parody scenes as well for the Hamlet scenes, which engaged our imaginations even more. And I was the person who wrote ours with some feedback from people. There was did a parody of Spaceballs where you have, Lone Star, I am your brother's father's cousin's former roommate. And I think I rewrote that perfectly when Hamlet sees his ghost dad. He's like, what is it? I am your mother's brother's sister's former lover. That might not be what it was, but within, that was his father. But then it's the former wife and I played out all the relationships in the most roundabout way, but it was actually true. It was just another way of him saying, I'm your father. I thought it was very clever because I like Spaceballs and Mel Brooks, and I like to think that I'm clever, and I have an imagination. There are, however, at least two varieties of imagination in the reader's case. We're getting to that stuff I was talking about that never left me. So let us see which one of the two is the right one to use in reading a book. First, there is the comparatively lowly kind which turns for support to the simple emotions and is of a definitively personal nature. There are various sub-varieties here in this first section of emotional reading. The situation in a book is intensely felt because it reminds us of something that happened to us or to someone we know or knew. Or again, a reader treasures a book mainly because it evokes a country, a landscape, a mode of living, which he nostalgically recalls as part of his own past. Or, and this is the worst thing a reader can do, he identifies himself with a character in the book. This lowly variety is not the kind of imagination I would like readers to use. Remember when I talked about the critics on Twitter that got books canceled? I think particularly about the Chinese woman who wrote a fantasy series that involves slavery. I feel like Nabokov nailed some of the premise here. At least surmising. I'm going to toss this theory out there. Again, a reader treasures a book mainly because it evokes a country, a landscape, a mode of living which he nostalgically recalls as part of his own past. Or, this is the worst thing a reader can do, identifies himself with a character in the book. If it's not of a certain ethnic origin of people who were enslaved, you can't identify with those other characters. You can't identify with fictional characters being enslaved unless they look like you. And that's part of the problem of cancel culture. Not to say that there's going to be unlikable characters and you might run into bad fiction anyways that doesn't portray things in an imaginative way, and he's kind of talked about that already. But that's kind of the criticism that I think about. That was the first thing that came to mind. And it's just because it's something that's so strongly resonated with me as an author of why should I want to go to these larger publishing houses if I'm going to write about topics that by a vocal minority that has some sort of sway over larger publishing companies don't like that I'm a white guy writing about things, why should I bother with those publishing companies? Not to say I'll necessarily find an audience here. At least maybe 5 people watch this video. I don't know. Maybe 5 people read my books. Hopefully they're impactful or there's something to learn there. Once you separate out all the garbage in them, my writing's not up to par. But bad readers, to an extent, determine books getting canceled. And they haven't even read the books. How insane is that? And it makes me wonder when it comes to the editors in these book companies, how good are the editors? No offense, editors. I hope that you love my writing and that you want to publish my book if I ever bother to send it to you. Maybe. Maybe not. I'll speak truth to power. That's what we do as authors. We try to speak truth to power. This next section, I also have most of the latter of this is bracketed. This was read in class or possibly in a tutorial section. So, what is the authentic instrument to be used by the reader? It is impersonal, imagination, and artistic delight. What should be established, I think, is an artistic, harmonious balance between the reader's mind in the author's mind. We ought to remain a little aloof and take pleasure in this aloofness, while at the same time we keenly enjoy, passionately enjoy with tears and shivers, the inner weave of a given masterpiece. I can't, I read this and I just get emotional as I think about it. And not necessarily because I read this and I'm like, I'm a good reader or I'm a good writer, but he's getting just at the core of the intimate relationship between reader and writer. And it's not, I can't think of the last time I read something that wrote about it this way. Last person that talked about it this way. The closest thing I can think about is like a pastor talking about the relationship that God wants to have with someone, which is something that's gleaned out of prayer and meditation on Scripture, where there is an authoritative or authorial intent of the Bible to establish a relationship with people to make their lives better. And people are going to have all sorts of criticisms about, is the Bible really doing that? Whatever. Like, that's the intent. And I won't even necessarily go into if those people are good readers or good writers. But that's the intent. At least if you go look at the New Testament and can set aside the Old Testament for a moment. It takes patience and time to get through it. Just like with other works of fiction. Not that the Bible's fiction. That's right. I'll go there. It is impersonal imagination and artistic delight. What should be established, I think, is an artistic harmonious balance between the reader's mind and the author's mind. We ought to remain a little aloof and take pleasure in this aloofness, while at the same time we keenly enjoy, passionately enjoy with tears and shivers the inner weave of a given masterpiece. To be quite objective in these matters is, of course, impossible. Everything that is worthwhile is to some extent subjective. For instance, you sitting there may be merely my dream, and I may be your nightmare. I'm definitely, there's parts of my work that, because of the substance, I think is going to be there. It is a nightmare for me. And sadly, in this world, we have to confront nightmares, and that's something that I try to do in my writing. And I hope it's something that I have readers that are willing to confront those nightmares with me. But what I mean is that the reader must know when and where to curb his imagination, and this he does by trying to get clear and specific world the author places at his disposal. We must see things and hear things. We must visualize the rooms, the clothes, the manners of the author's people. The color of Fanny Price's eyes in Mansfield Park and the furnishing of her cold little room are important. I've been wanting to rewatch the Naruto manga series, and I think about One Piece when I read this. Naruto is a serialized comic book. There's an animated version that was serialized that I believe started in 1997 and concluded in, I think, 2014. So, what? Is that 17 years? Can I do math? Something like that. I think it's about 17 years. And was all of this encapsulated in that? Because the One Piece, as well as Naruto, started in an era of comics where they have a much slower kind of start getting into them. It takes several chapters, maybe like a dozen or more chapters, 20, 30 chapters possibly for some people to really, for One Piece to hit the stride of the depth of the story that you're going to get into, that level of imagination that you'll be engaged in. There's definitely engagement when it involves the superpowers and stuff. But there's definitely, when reading One Piece, that level of remaining aloof and take pleasure in the aloofness. It's a very comedic series, and Ichiro Oda's can be very aloof with how the characters act and what happens. While at the same time, we keenly enjoy, passionately enjoy with tears and shivers the inner weave of a given masterpiece. And all you have to do is go look up Naruto chapter reactions by people like Rogers Base or King of Lightning, or look up their One Piece reactions to, especially see Roger, to go through the enjoy passionately, enjoy with tears and shivers, the interweave of a given masterpiece, where to actually have people, and there's anime reactions of people just like crying watching this. Or I think of Kevin Smith watching the end of season 1 of Flash, where he is so caught up in Barry Allen's events where he's just bawling his eyes out. I think of Rogers Base, there's moments where it's like he has to grab his pillow and scream into his pillow when there's events happening in One Piece. Or where he gets up, stomps off, and then throws like a binder or a pillow into the curtains because of how upset he is that there is too much aloofness that is happening involving Big Mom and Wano. To be quite objective in these matters is, of course, impossible. Everything that is worthwhile is to some extent subjective. For instance, you sitting there may be entirely my dream, and I may be your nightmare. But what I mean is that the reader must know when and where to curb his imagination, and this he does by trying to get clear and specific world the author places at his disposal. We must see things and hear things. We must visualize the rooms, the clothes, the manner of an author's people. The color of Fanny Price's eyes in Mansfield Park, and the furnishing of her cold little room are important. This section, as well as the previous, talking about the different varieties of imagination in readers. This is how I move forward in my fiction. To take those chances to explore the nightmare. And to be willing to deal with characters that honestly, it's like, do I want to write the characters in a way that 90% of people won't accept them and would walk away? Or do I want to write characters where 90% of them, of the audience, are just going to like them and will stick around? And what are the risks between those two? When I can think about it in terms of sales versus the artistic sense of which one's more artistic. And it's hard to know without me necessarily giving out the plot, but it's like the artistic one, I'd say, is for the advanced readers, and the less artistic one may have that mass audience appeal. And if I'm not hitting that appeal, right, readers may just walk away, and that's something that I wrestle with. And it's like I think about toning down aspects of my fiction, but some of the elements, the ideas, the notions, how the superpowers and things work, the character interactions, I'm hitting on very specific metaphors and story ideas to push myself as a person, that the purpose there is to challenge the assumptions and to push people from where they're very comfortable into a very uncomfortable place, a very vulnerable place. And the vulnerable and uncomfortable places are where we have to go to grow. Like, if you're a plant, just can spread everywhere. Like, you can grow, but to what degree, how strong are your limbs going to be? Versus if you put a plant in a box and the plant is trying to push out of a box. And what do we see when we just go see random holes in the concrete? We see plants pushing up through the concrete. Are they big plants? Nah, it depends on how long they've had to gestate and to grow. Well, like, that's a question I have to ask for myself of, to what degree do I want mass appeal? And there's definitely, like, mass appeal for books that go to those places. I would say One Piece goes into slavery, racism, very hard. And I think that's why And Oda takes a lot of chances, and he's someone, as well as a creative Naruto, where I think about what does God put people on Earth to do in life, and it's like I look at their books and I'm just like, God put them here to tell these stories. And to a degree, that's kind of how I feel about not all of my writing. Some of my writing, I'm just an idiot. But there's other writing that I write as if that's the case. Of I am putting together the ultimate court case, the ultimate argument through fiction to open up people's eyes, their minds, to push fiction and storytelling to that next level, 2022 and beyond. Will I have a legacy or an influence? I don't know. But I know that I have stories that I need to get better at telling them. There's no doubt about that. I'm not a good enough storyteller for the type of stories that I tell, but I got to deal with where I'm at, unfortunately. I'm still growing, I'm still learning. But I can at least say I'm at the point where we can see and hear things, where I help people visualize rooms, the clothes of my people, and the color of people's eyes, and understand why where they live and how they live is important. What I mean is that the reader must know when and where to curb his imagination, and this he does by trying to get clear the specific world the author places at his disposal. One of the things I thought about when I thought about what is the author's nightmare was how Jordan Peterson, in his lectures, tries to help people understand, his students, how easily they can become a guard at Auschwitz. How many steps away are we from becoming depraved, horrible people? Do I have that capacity within me for that to happen? I believe that I do. And I've taken steps to not have that happen. But there's definitely a version of me where I could see that happening. I could definitely see a non-Christian version of me letting that happen. Or becoming a depraved person in some other area. But that is where we are pushing our imaginations, where we are pushing ourselves into imagine yourself becoming a Nazi guard. And how do you actually go through those steps? And that's something I write about in my fiction as well. I have sections where I have characters that are in Prague visiting concentration camps, because I wanted to try to figure out a way to process my thoughts and emotions about when I was at the camps in Terezin, in the ghetto of Terezin. I deal with it in the first chapter of my of my book, which is already kind of out there, about Ottokar's wife. Nazis come to his store to arrest him because he has he's been having marionette shows with a marionette Hitler, and they say, like, we're arresting you because you're making fun of Hitler. And then he finds out the same time they came to arrest him, they sent people to his house, and when he gets home, his wife and his infant are gone, and he finds his 7 or 8 year old son hiding in a magician's box, like in a hidden compartment. And then him and his son get up and leave. Oh, those hot topics I like to write about. Let's get through this. We're almost 2 hours in. Thank you for getting to this point. We all have different temperaments, and I can tell you right now that the best temperament for a reader to have or to develop is a combination of the artistic and the scientific one. The enthusiastic artist alone is apt to be too subjective in his attitude towards a book, and so a scientific coolness of judgment will temper the intuitive heart. If, however, a would-be reader is utterly devoid of passion and patience, of an artist's passion and a scientist's patience, he will hardly enjoy great literature. I'm going to tie this back up into that idea of, for instance, you sitting there may be merely my dream and I may be your nightmare. If we're to take that as far as the dream of the audience being part of my dream, and the story that you're in is your nightmare that you're going through. Can you get past the nightmare to enjoy great literature? What is great literature? And I suppose he doesn't necessarily, he covers that to a degree here. All right. 2 pages left. Literature was born not the day when a boy crying wolf came running out of the Neanderthal Valley with a big gray wolf at his heels. Literature was born on the day when a boy came crying wolf, and there was no wolf behind him. That poor little fellow, because he lied too often, was finally eaten up by a real beast, is quite incidental. But here is what is important. Between the wolf in the tall grass and the wolf in the tall story, there is a shimmering go-between. That go-between, that prism, is the art of literature. Literature is invention. Fiction is fiction. To call a story a true story is an insult to both art and truth. Every great writer is a great deceiver, but so is that arch cheat, nature. Nature always deceives. From the simple deception of propagation to the prodigiously sophisticated illusion of protective colors and butterflies or birds, there is in nature a marvelous system of spells and wiles. The writer of fiction only follows nature's lead. Nabokov was into butterflies, so it's very, he has, his inserts in his books are people catching, ornithography or something to specialize in butterflies. He really gets into this. Going back for a moment, I no longer have the printed version. I may not read it as clearly off the screen. Can I make it bigger? There we go. A little bit bigger. Going back for a moment to our wolf-crying woodland little woolly fellow, we may put it this way. The magic of art was in the shadow of the wolf, and he deliberately invented his dream of the wolf. Then the story of his tricks made a good story. When he perished at last, the story told about him acquired a good lesson in the dark around the campfire. When he perished at last, the story told about him acquired a good lesson in the dark around the campfire. But he was the little magician. He was the inventor. There are 3 points of view from which a writer can be considered. He may be considered as a storyteller, as a teacher, and as an enchanter. A major writer combines these 3: storyteller, teacher, enchanter. But it is the enchanter in him that predominates and makes him a major writer. To the storyteller we turn for entertainment, for mental excitement of the simplest kind, for emotional participation, for the pleasure of traveling in some remote region in space or time. A slightly different, though not necessarily higher mind looks for the teacher in the writer. Propagandist, moralist, prophet, this is the rising sequence. We may go to the teacher not only for moral education, but also for direct knowledge for simple facts. Alas, I have known people whose purpose in reading the French and Russian novelists was to learn something about life in gay Paris or in sad Russia. Finally, and above all, a great writer is always a great enchanter, and it is here that we come to the really exciting part when we try to grasp the individual magic of his genius and to study the style, the imagery, the pattern of his novels or poems. The 3 facets of the great writer, magic, story, lesson, are prone to blend in one impression of unified and unique radiance, since the magic of art may be present in the very bones of the story, in the very marrow of thought. There are masterpieces of dry, limpid, organized thought, which provoke us in an artistic quiver quite as strongly as a novel like Mansfield Park does, or as any rich flow of Dickensian sensual imagery. It seems to me that a good formula to test the quality of a novel is, in the long run, a merging of the precision of poetry and the intuition of science. In order to bask in that magic, a wise reader reads the book of genius not with his heart, not so much with his brain, but with his spine. It is there that occurs the telltale tingle, even though we must keep a little aloof, a little detached when reading. Then, when a pleasure which is both sensual and intellectual, we shall watch the artist build his castle of cards, and watch the castle of cards become a castle of beautiful steel and glass. 1948. I read this and I can't help but ask myself, it's like, where does he say it about the storyteller, teacher, and enchanter? Without knowing this language, it's like this is what I know, at least I've tried to do. And I assume anyone who sets out to write a story, these are the things that they're wanting to do. But I can kind of mark that off my list. Whether or not I'm good at all of them is somewhat to be determined by good readers. Let's say good readers, not just any readers, but good readers. But man, this is heavy. It's 2 hours for me just to read this and process this to myself, and it's only 12 pages or so. I'm just gonna have to like read this and meditate on it. This is kind of like a Bible. This is like the Matthew of storytelling, or the John. I guess probably more like the Book of John of storytelling. What are we? What all is there to learn about being a good reader, good writer? What does it mean to be an enchanter? And in reading that, I might just read some of this again. Major writer combines the three. To the storyteller, we turn for entertainment, for mental excitement of the simplest kind, for emotional participation, for the pleasure of traveling in some remote region in time or space. A slightly different, though not necessarily higher mind looks for the teacher in the writer. Propagandist, moralist, prophet, this is the rising sequence. We may go to the teacher not only for moral education, but also for direct knowledge for simple facts. Last, I have known people whose purpose in reading the French and Russian novelists was to learn something about life in gay Paris or in sad Russia. Finally, above all, a great writer is always a great enchanter, and it is here that we come to a really exciting part when we try to grasp the individual magic of his genius and to study the style, the imagery, the pattern of his novels or poems. The three facets of the great writer: magic, story, lesson, are prone to blend in one impression of unified and unique radiance, since the magic of art may be present in the very bones of the story, the very marrow of thought. There are masterpieces of dry, limpid, organized thought which provoke in us an artistic quiver quite as strong as which provoke in us an artistic quiver quite as strong as a novel like Mansfield Park does, or any rich flow of Dickensian sensual imagery. It seems to me that a good formula to test the quality of a novel is, in the long run, emerging in the precision of poetry and the intuition of science. How well can you pinpoint the word to the storytelling within a realized, understandable environment? In order to bask in that magic, a wise reader reads the book of genius not with his heart, not so much with his brain, but with his spine. It is there that occurs the telltale tingle, even though we must keep a little aloof, little detached when reading. Then, with a pleasure which is both sensual and intellectual, we shall watch the artist build his castle of cards, and watch the castle of cards become a castle of beautiful steel and glass. And I think there's that question of, reading that last section, what are the quality of the stories that we see in movies versus if we were to watch plays or operas or reading books? What's the difference between 12 issues of X-Men and 30 or 20 plus years of a continued story written by one author? I used to be impressed by Frank Miller and his Sin City, which I have right here. I have 2 copies of Volume 1, up through Session 7, where it's written, drawn, all by him. All of his own original characters kind of take on hard-boiled fiction in Vegas type thing, versus Kishimoto writing Naruto for 17 years and drawing it. I don't know to what degree the editors play into some of the storytelling decisions, but the very bones of the story in which Mero thought, these masterpieces are dry, limpid, organized thought which provoke us. And I guess that's the biggest takeaway here is, what does it mean for you as a reader, for myself as a reader and a writer, for you as a writer, to read with your spine, to be able to experience the passion and emotion of the story, and to be able to set aside moments of reality. I'm totally blanking on the term for where you're like popped out of a story, where they're breaking the fourth wall or something. How to get past those moments where it's like, okay, that didn't really make sense, but I can accept it. You broke me out of the story, but I can accept it. Let's just keep going. Or you're reading something that is terrifying. You're reading a nightmare. And how do you get by that, get past your emotions, and get past possibly breaking the fourth wall, or I can't think of the term that I want. And to read something through with your spine, and to get to the deeper meaning of the art, of the literature, to experience that. Where there's the question, to what degree going to Auschwitz, Determinant Camp 1, to what degree there's an artistic intent in how they set up the displays. But you would walk into one of the housing units, and there would be a plate of glass or clear plastic, and then on the other side, nothing else, like would be open floor, except that they've just put in all of the false limbs, appendages, and crutches. So fake arms, fake legs, just piled floor to halfway up to the ceiling. Or the piles of just suitcases of all the people that they had their stuff confiscated. Or, even worse, an entire room floor to ceiling of just the hair that had been shaved off people. And you can get caught up in the emotion. You're, to an extent, confronted with a reality that is very hard to accept on that premise of this is real. Or can it be real even? You can question it while you're there. Like, is this simply some sort of deranged dark art that they're presenting me, or is this a artistic interpretation of the remains of history that is there before me? And you're going there, you've already been kind of building up your spine to see it, and I'm sure that there's places in the world that it takes a spine to go somewhere, but to take those things in, and as an audience member, and this is the dark version of where it talks about the telltale tingle, even though we must keep a little aloof, a little detached from reading. There is a level of going there that you are detached, and you might become reattached afterwards. And I know that's not necessarily talking about this, but there is a question of what is art, and he's talking about specifically with fiction. But there is a sense of like someone's telling a story when you go to Auschwitz, and there is they're trying to tell the story of it. and you are the audience. Then, with the pleasure, which is both sensual and intellectual, we shall watch the artist build his castle of cards and watch the castle of cards become a castle of beautiful steel and glass. I think it was interesting seeing this happen when I was to shift modes, seeing this happen with reading David Nance's book, of just being able to follow along in the process. And it is a complete draft. There were pretty much like less than a dozen typos that I can think of where it's just like he had two spaces or missed a paragraph indentation. And there's definitely stylistic things that I preferred and things that I think would make the book better. But by the end, it was a castle of steel and glass, and there is a jump there that I kind of described when I was reading his book as I got toward the ends of, and Nabokov just nails it here. The idea of watch the castle of cards, and when you get to the end of a book, when you're writing it especially, and you can think about this as a reader, and you get to the end of a book, what does it look like for it to become steel and glass? It's that those final chapters, that last 100 pages or 50 pages, is able to hold up everything that's come before it. That there is a proper payoff when the writing is there, the plot, and I mean the quality of the writing, the quality of the storytelling is there, the characters are still there, and you're not completely just ending with some sort of empty preconceived plot without a whole lot of emotion and written because you're bored because you knew what stuff was going to happen the entire time. You're not exploring the world, or however he put it. Things just didn't go. And there's definitely a sense when you get to the end, it's hard to just kind of let things go. It's very easy to try to like pull everyone in. And sometimes that's just not how it happens. And you can still have the sense that like, oh, this was planned out. And to an extent, the end of a novel a lot of times is going to be kind of planned out. I can say for my work, it's like I had to figure out between different books. Is a character hitting a particular thought/plot point a good enough place to kind of wrap things up, and their mindset has changed for the next book, while the plot continues on in the same manner. Although the plot is the character will change along with the plot and whatnot. Kind of like right now, am I the steel and the glass at the end of this video able to hold up everything that's come before it? I can't necessarily say as I wrap this up, but I hope you're able to walk away with something. Go pick this up, go read this, meditate on this. If you're a teacher, read this for yourself. Read it with your students and talk through it so that we have a generation of good readers, not shallow readers or shallow storytellers. This is here to embolden students, to embolden writers. That's why Nabokov took the time to write this. And Nabokov is one heck of a good writer, although it's not for me necessarily to say what content is good for high schoolers. A lot of his books are, at least the ones I've read, have different levels of romance in them. Maybe it's Lucian's Defense in Russian, but it's The Defense in English, the title. That doesn't really deal with romance, but like Mary, King, Queen, Knave is kind of like an advanced version of Mary, which involves people having affairs. The Eye is kind of a version of those things. What's the Despair? I think that's I'm trying to remember if Despair was the fifth book. A lot of them just deal with romantic boy-girl relationship type stuff. But the quality of writing is there. I'm just not. I kind of wish he was writing on other content, to be honest. Go read Stephen Harrigan's The Gates of the Alamo. I got that right above me, and that's one of the books that I've done rainbow drafts for, and one of the ones that I love the storytelling as well. It's about historical. It's about the Alamo and stuff leading into that. But yeah, expose this to your students. Expose it to your friends. Have people over and talk about it. Put it on your coffee table. Just be like, why is that on your table? And be like, you should read it. Let's talk about it. Because we're in a world where I don't know if it's due to like schooling, colleges, probably have to do with high schools and colleges and even elementary schools. Not having read something like this and not knowing what it means to be a good writer, good reader, where very much in this postmodern world, it's easy to be like, my opinion matters the most. And you can't tell me what this means. It means something different to me. These words, what you're saying is, it harms me, it hurts me. And we don't even we don't even share the same vocabulary sometimes, to be honest, and it's difficult. And this is a grounding work for understanding what is a good vocabulary and good way to process how to be a good reader or a good writer. He lays it out for us in a very good way. And it's been a while since I've read any, like, I think a 10th grade literature book from Chicago Public Schools, or maybe I have a 5th grade one, but that's from like 12 years ago, and I have one for high school it's a Becca book, I think, out of Pensacola Christian College that was used in high schools, Christian schools. Is I can read those and be like, does that address any of these things? Or is it just kind of like, oh, look at these writers, and let's just like read these fun stories that, they tell us scientific things and not necessarily well written literature. And then that is a question of like, to what degree do I want should my work be published because it's just a form of literature, or do I want it, or is publication good enough? And there's the question of, to what degree do I care about critics? Are critics even good readers or good writers anymore? It's like we go look at the Oscar people like that, and it's kind of like, I don't know. Or Eskimo Cowboy, a bunch of people wanted one of their songs put up for Eurovision, and we watched the Eurovision songs that were put up there, and it's just kind of like, who are the people that decided? Because this stuff just seems like normal mainstream, not art. Let's put it that way. Where it's like, to what degree is Eskimo Cowboy art? It's like, I don't know. They're at least taking chances in pushing things in artistic directions, but it's hard to a degree to satisfy critics in that manner. And there's plenty of artistic films and things out there that get like 0 on Rotten Tomatoes by audiences. And that's not necessarily say that all those audiences are like bad readers, but either way, this is all stuff to challenge yourself. Do you want to be a regular reader or a good reader or a bad reader? Which one are you? And hopefully, through just the engagement that we have through my discussions online, we'll be able to all grow in that manner. And I'll be growing as I'm learning more about myself as I read my own writing and I'm breaking down what other writers have to say. So that's it. This is Brooke, breaking down the pages of Good Readers and Writers by Vladimir Nabokov. Go check out his books. I love him, although I've only read like the first 5. And I'm waiting to get to the good stuff that comes later. Have a great day.